Good morning, everybody. My name is Jason Warfield. I'm responsible for pre-sales for CA's continuous delivery business in North America. The topic of today's session is breaking down barriers to DevSecOps. And if our prep call was any indication, this will be a very lively discussion. I'm joined here by a very esteemed group of panelists. In fact, the best group of panelists ever I've had the opportunity to moderate. Now, it also happens to be the first panel that I've had the opportunity to moderate. But I'm looking forward to the discussion today. So I'll give each of you an opportunity to briefly introduce yourselves, if you don't mind. We'll start with you, Ray.
Yes, so I'm Ray Renner. I'm a technical fellow at Northrop Grumman and the chief engineer of our Software Center of Excellence. So in that role, I'm one of our Agile coaches, but my main job is setting up best practices, tooling, and helping coach programs on advancing software development processes. Of course, these days, you know, my biggest role is being a DevOps evangelist and getting those practices rolled out.
Aruna Ravichandran. I'm the Vice President of Marketing and Strategy for DevOps portfolio at CA Technologies. Played in the DevOps world for a pretty long time. I'm very passionate about this topic, and I basically talk to a lot of customers worldwide in all different sectors and regions, and translate the value they have actually shared with me in terms of being able to share that with other customers. I actually wrote a book called DevOps for Digital Leaders, where I learned a lot of case studies from multiple different customers and articulated that in that particular book.
Hi, I'm Tracy Bannon. I'm a specialist leader with Deloitte Consulting. I focus on cloud-native implementations, and obviously DevOps is a key part of that in DevSecOps. I'm part of our global practice around DevOps and our national practice for cloud-native. Primarily been focused in the federal space for about 2 years, but did quite a lot of time before that in our commercial sector, including state and local governments. So been making my rounds in a couple of different areas.
And as I mentioned a moment ago, this session is focused on DevSecOps, which there's been a lot of chatter in the market about recently. So one of the things we wanted to do to open up the session was really share the different perspectives on the term, because there are some folks who believe that, quite frankly, the term doesn't need to exist because security has been a natural part of DevOps from the very begining. So why don't we open it up with you, Tracy, on your perspective of the term DevSecOps.
You just stole my perspective. So I am one of those advocates. Every system that I design, every team that I work with for as long as my entire career, security has been a part of that. You don't deal with your client's data by not securing it, by not thinking about every aspect, whether it's the pipeline or whether it's the solution itself. So when I've seen the word, or the phoneme, right, when I see sec added in there, whether it's at the beginning of it, the middle of it, I've seen it added to the end. You've probably heard ruggedized DevOps. I think of it more of a mnemonic. It's something that we should have been doing all along. If we weren't, shame on us, shame on those who weren't. But it does force our attention so that we are making a consideration of driving security the full way, I like to say the full way to the left of the spectrum from the very time we are visioning the whole way through. So it's not what we do at the very end, where we do some penetration testing and some scanning and have a bunch of OFU moments.
So adding on to what Tracy said, I think the reason the word sec, like you say, is gaining precedence in the market is because I think in the last 2-3 years, people have actually started to think about it from a DevOps concept even more, right? So you should be thinking about security from the beginning. There is no doubt on that. But in the last 3-4 years, I think it's been gaining precedence. And also talking about some of the tools in the market. There are a lot more tools available to enable customers to actually shift left. And we at CA Technologies, we really want to enable our customers by providing you with a complete tool sets across your entire software development lifecycle. And so recently we acquired a company by name Veracode. And with Veracode acquisition, we now have the ability to provide our customers with the opportunity to be able to leverage the tool sets in order to think about security very much in the design phase itself.
Yes, I also agree with the, I personally don't use it normally in my day-to-days. I just say DevOps, but sometimes you put that sec in there to make sure we're talking about pulling it, like you say, pulling it all the way to the left, getting them involved, getting security involved from the very beginning, instead of waiting to accreditation time and you go in and start, doing it. And it's like, oh, I did not know, that was a requirement from a security point of view, right? The developer's surprised, oh, I can't do that. You didn't want me to do that. Let's pull that out to the left. And also, I think the other big thing is getting security involved in the very beginning, especially to make sure not only do the requirements articulated, but to get them comfortable with things like the automated testing and getting that being part of the culture to accept, automated security testing and things like that, so that you can cut your accreditation, at least from, coming from the DoD and Intel type space, cutting the accreditation time way down. If if they can go, oh yes, I see all your automated security tests. We're just going to do some spot checking and we can move on, right? Because that's going to be one of our big holdbacks from getting. And there is a big holdbacks from getting things out rapidly, deployed rapidly, right? Is the ability to shorten down accreditation time.
Well, do you see the same way that DevOps used to fight? Well, they still fight, or maybe they don't. SEC was something that we wanted to avoid cyber because they're the roadblock to us getting out the door.
Absolutely.
So this also gives an opportunity for cyber and for our security folks to be involved at the very beginning with our assets. And what I mean by that is, for my developers, I provide them with assets, jump starts, right? I don't want everybody greenfielding and just starting from scratch, right? We do whatever we can to help our teams to move as quickly as possible. So if I have cyber involved and they are helping me with the secure coding standards, and we're setting those up from the very beginning, if I am putting jumpstart images together, giving them Dockers and containers and other things, and they've already scanned, they've taken a look at those, they're a lot more comfortable with that. So there is a peace of mind, although it doesn't mean that you shift your diligence. So I think that that's helping to break down on some of the, I don't know.
The friction.
The friction, good word, friction.
So Ray, as a chief engineer responsible for DevOps practices across a very large set of development organizations, do you feel that developers are embracing security? And what are some of the best ways to incorporate security into the DevOps process?
I think we're slowly getting there for getting developers to embrace security, right? It's more and more they're starting to think about it from the beginning. It's the big thing is trying to get it not only, in our company, right, is not only get it, is all the different types of developers, right? The people doing IT systems are probably a lot further along than are people doing embedded systems and things like that. But we've got to drive that security awareness, security thinking, all the way, to the entire breadth of the types of development that we do.
Well, if you give them a way to identify the defects, right? So educate them up front, but then give them away. Instead of me handing my code to you and you scanning it and then giving me a report, or worse yet, giving it to a team lead who then gives me my part of the report, right, very publicly, I can run it myself. I can run unit tests myself, so why can't I run some kinds of security tests myself, right? So that I can get closer to and I can deal with that defect, right?
Right, and that's one of the reasons to bring security in way up front, because a lot of times it's like that I can't tell you what the tests are going to be, right? Because you'll work around them, right? Instead of, right, we want to know what the tests are so that we can be testing them and fixing them months ahead of time.
And adding on to that, right? So one of the key things in terms of, that's a cultural change, being able to get the developers to actually embrace and do security scan analysis or vulnerability checking. And the big part of that is, from a developer perspective, how easy are the tools going to make my life easy, right? Like if I'm going to be running those tests, I'm adding additional work onto my daily agenda, or are there tools out there which will help me, cut the mark? And again, speaking about the recent acquisition we made with Veracode, a big part of the acquisition actually focuses on that, because we did a study with an external vendor and ask the exact same topic, right? Like, do you have the right set of tools? Will you actually implement security testing as a part of your daily check-in portfolio, whether you're doing integration testing or your JUnit testing? And what they came back and told us is, if there are the right tools available and we don't have to go through a whole bunch of compliance mandate, we'll happily include that. And by getting that kind of a feedback from the developer community, we actually came out with a new product, which is a plugin, which is now available with all of the, the IDEs in the market, like Microsoft Visual Studio and Eclipse. There is a product now called Greenlight. It's automatically embedded into an IDE, so when they're actually doing their unit testing for their module, they can actually kick that off in order to basically do the security scan analysis. And the other thing also from a cultural point of view is, if you actually want to do any one of your risk scans, don't you think that they'll have to worry about whether can they do it in a self-contained environment, right? So that's another thing which development teams all definitely worry about. And so again, we have another tool which is called Veracode Developer Sandbox, which gives you the ability to automatically do your static code analysis within your contained environment. So the big part is to be able to evangelize not just the CA tools, the tools in the market, which basically brings about that cultural shift across the board, which makes their job easier.
If you go back to people, process, and technology, it's cliche, but it still holds true. There's going to have to be a cultural shift, right? That comes whether you're calling it DevSecOps, whether you're talking about it from Agile. There has to be a mindset shift. The people who are coming together and having transparency and communication together, that piece has to happen. Your processes obviously have to change. If you are moving away from complete reliance on end security testing and starting to put that scanning, that testing, the reviews, et cetera, throughout the life cycle, the people part becomes an enablement through the tools. And to your point, try to enable without disabling, right? In the past, we have unintentionally disabled people and caused them to try and find ways around, right? Like water going down a hill, right? They're going to go whatever is the fastest path to get where they need to go.
How do you all see DevOps or DevSecOps progressing in government?
We can all jump in on that. Go ahead.
Right. I mean, slowly, right? I think there still needs to be some education. I certainly know I was talking to a customer, and they were showing me something they were calling CM, and it turned out they were really talking about DevOps, right? But it is getting there. I think it's you can't, in my opinion, you can't do Agile without doing DevOps, right? So as the Agile practices are getting out there, the DevOps practices have to, right? Because you're going to quickly get crushed under the weight.
But you can do DevOps without Agile.
Absolutely.
Not to be a heretic.
Right. No. We have the same discussions.
The automations can be there.
And you have that, the Agile purists that say, oh, no, you got to be Agile. But, it's good engineering practices, right?
Well, there are.
Every project should be doing that.
Well, I'm going to guess that anything that your teams are doing that's net new, DevOps is table stakes. I know they are for my teams. Anything we're doing net new, DevOps is table stakes. If we are making major changes to something existing, then it becomes an evaluation. What's the risk that we have if we don't change this? What's the cost going to be to do this? If something is going to be sunset in a certain amount of time, maybe it doesn't make as much sense. So you do that value analysis, tracking back to what's important. Why are you doing DevOps in the first place? Generally, it's for speed, right? Generally, it's for quality, and it's for stability, right? Those are kind of the reasons, if I distill it down to the most basic piece of it, those are why you're going to do that. So it's coming back to those reasons when you're trying to decide. I think as our clients are doing a mix of net new and a whole lot of O&M, a whole lot, right? We've got systems, uncountable dollars worth of systems right now with that O&M. When they're making those decisions, I think they're sometimes getting caught around the axle of trying to get to some type of, I call it the magical singularity. This is how DevOps should be done. And You've got all kinds of different pipelines that are necessary in your enterprise. You are not going to use just one tool. You are going to use logical, lean sets of tools based on what it is you're pushing across these pipelines. And you're going to have it at different speeds. So one of your applications may have a daily push, sure, if that's relevant, if it's been architected that way. You may have another one where the speed is every 2 months or 3 months or 6 months, or if you're on a federal mandated cycle, it could be once a year. So I think it's all over the place, but everybody knows that it will help, but it requires a lot of rigor.
Speaking of rigor, so as Mike Gregoire mentioned in his keynote this morning, change is hard. So what are some of the key considerations to drive success, and how do you measure success and progress through the transition? Ray, let's start with you on that one.
So I think the big things is actually start measuring it, right? So you have something to measure, and I think some of the big things is, how long does it take for a fix to get, maybe not all the way out, right? Most, especially in the federal space, DoD type space, I'm not measuring how long is it going to take me to actually deploy it to the field, because often I have.
That might not be production, it might be right before.
Right, you're right,
Yep,
but measure
yep,
how long does
yep.
it take from either a new idea or identified defect to get fixed and get to ready to be deployed, right? And if that's what I want to measure, right? And that's what I want to get as short as possible.
So what I've seen talking to a whole bunch of clients and customers is that, again, going back to what she said, it depends upon what your primary goals are, whether it's quality, whether it's stability, whether it's, managing to the risk on what you're actually doing across the board. But generally what I've seen in terms of the metrics in the market is, I break it up into 3 different areas. One is customer metrics. Right? So when I say customer metrics is, what is your net promoter score? What was it before you actually, brought in DevOps practices, and what is your net promoter score now after we have actually implemented DevOps, because you want to be able to get a high satisfaction score across the board. Then another example is operational metrics. So operational metrics are things which he talked about, right? Throughput. How quickly can I go from code to production? And so that is a very important metric. Mean time to repair, right? Mean time to recover, deployment frequency, your defect density ratio. Have you been able to reduce the number of your defects across the board?
Churn becomes another one as well.
Very important one. And then the other one, which is at a higher level, is more like your business metrics, right? So business metrics could be things like your employee satisfaction, right? People actually want to work in companies and we actually did a survey through CA Technologies with an external vendor called Coleman Parks, where we actually measured, people who have successful DevOps implementation, or actually have not even successful, they have embraced DevOps implementations and they've brought about a cultural change within the company. How do you correlate that to employee retention, employee satisfaction, customer satisfaction? So there is a whole bunch of business metrics. So there is no free form metrics out there, but it completely comes down to what are going to be your topmost goals: the quality, the risk measurements, as well as your customer experience.
Right. It's easy to turn it into really a science fair project. It is, because everybody wants metrics, and there are boatloads of tables of all different kinds of metrics. It's like anything else. If you're a doctor and you're looking to solve a problem, a health problem, right, you're gonna zoom in and focus on the metrics or the measurements or the tests that are going to address that specific issue. So a lot of times when you're adopting DevOps, you are being driven by something, right? You're either pushed by circumstance or pulled by a dream. Most clients are being pushed by circumstance because they need to deal with different situations, and the metrics usually follow that.
Mm-hmm.
So Aruna, what would you say are some of the biggest or most common obstacles or challenges you've seen organizations and agencies run into?
I think the biggest one is the cultural change. From what I've seen, DevOps has been there now for almost a decade or so, right? So, but I've seen actually people the biggest barrier in terms of being able to make the change. It's not the tools, it's not the technology, it's actually the people part. The people and process part is the hardest one. And companies where they've started to embrace is, and when I say cultural change, it's a big change, especially in large companies, especially in government organization. The development teams are situated in a different geography, and they're pretty much measured upon how quickly can they bring code into production. And if you look at the ops side, they're thinking about the stability, right? So how do you marry both of them together? How do you actually build an organization which will basically enable both the dev teams as well as the op teams to march together with a combined goal across the board?
Well, to add on to what you're talking about from a change perspective, most of the agencies that I've been working with are still organized around waterfall.
Yep.
And they've evolved that way, and they were very, very effective when we were defining requirements for 18 months, and then we were building for a year or two, and then we were testing. And so you had organizations where you passed things off, and there were very elaborate handoffs from one to the other. It doesn't work. And at least it doesn't, and now you have, over the years, you have silos that were unintentional silos, but silos that grew. The hardest part of that becomes taking a horizontal sliver, and then how do you pull those people together and get them to work together? Well, I'm matrixed, I answer to this person. So the organization right now is keeping people. Mm-hmm. So people are the hard part, but it's the organizational construct that they're living within that I think makes it the most difficult. I'm a technologist who doesn't like to say this, but it's not the technology.
Right. Yeah, I would agree. Right. The culture is a big one. Right. I often go in and says, well, but this is the way we've been doing it for the last 15
exactly.
years. Right.
How do you change?
How do I change? Oh, but we have to do this elaborate handoff this way because this is the way we've always done it. It is a big one. I think in a lot of our space, often there's also the problem of dev is one contractor, ops is another contractor,
that's exactly right.
and the two have opposing goals, right? And opposing payoffs, right? And they're not incentivized to work together.
I think that's going to be a big challenge, right?
Yes.
Is how do you contract for this as you go forward? How do you build those teams if you are having multiple different vendors and SIs that are in there? Yeah, it's not insignificant.
So speaking of that, what are some of the ways or ideas or approaches that you've leveraged to foster collaboration across development and operations?
I would say one, which I've seen a lot of vendors actually implement, is to basically have an executive champion at the top, right? So if if you want to basically align the dev teams and the ops teams towards a common goal, you need to basically have an executive champion who basically will help basically take away all of the hurdles you are actually going to face in terms of creating that horizontal stack. And a large vendor in the Bay Area, one of the large tax providers actually, the CIO became the executive champion. And you need someone at the top in order to actually make the change. And people will ask me, would it be a CTO, would it be a CIO, would it be a VP of Ops? It needs to be someone credible who basically makes it his main agenda and empowers people. Because when you're making that kind of a change, and it's a big cultural change, it's not just about rewarding successes, it's also being able to celebrate the ability of the team to take a risk and make the change.
That executive will fail, though, if they are not freed up to focus on it. So it can't be an extracurricular. And I'm seeing that with some of my clients that it is an extracurricular. So they agree that there needs to be an executive champion, and they have the person with the right passion. Unfortunately, they don't have enough backfill so that it doesn't become two jobs. And so then it becomes a lot of trade-offs. And your production systems right now that you're dealing with and the projects that are already in flight, those have a tendency to take precedence over some cultural change or starting to adopt new tools. Another technique that we've been using at Deloitte is something we've been kind of calling jokingly a dojo. The idea that I don't want to call it a center of excellence per se, but go ahead and establish a space. Go ahead and dedicate a small group of people working on particular pieces, and allow people to rotate in, allow them to be exposed to it, allow them to come and play with the tools, allow them to have someone to come and talk to about it. So as you are starting to roll out, you have that place, that safe place. It's almost like a library setting, right, where you can go and get smart. You can see the stickies on the wall. You can see the backlogs. You can touch and feel the tools, and you can have someone to talk with.
Just adding on to that, another great example I can share with you, who actually have implemented that for a brand new mobile app, which they were planning to roll out, was National Australia Bank. They went, so their CTO actually decided that, he wants to basically get from code to production, not in months, not in days, in actually minutes. And that was a big bar, because National Australia Bank has been there for several decades, and their primary goal was to basically get a 5-star rating on their mobile app. And so he made tremendous amount of changes within the organization, but he chose that new app, which was being rolled out on a brand new basis, right? So it's not, he didn't take an existing application and made that particular change. He took a small set of people across the board within the company, created this center of excellence, fine-tuned it, constantly refined it, and it took them 18 months to basically get the product out.
So I agree with both of those sets, as having executive, sponsorship. We actually calls ours a center of excellence, where I actually happen to work as one of those mechanisms. And the other one that I've really seen work well too is, if you build it, you deploy it, right? Making the development teams be part of the operations team.
Full responsibility.
Especially when possible, right? And actually encouraging our customers to take that sort of approach, even if we're not going to be there for the day-to-day operations, but making sure that they're part of that process, right? Because that way they see the bigger picture, right? They don't see the code ending when it, goes to test, right? Or
I found that's a challenge, is getting for the developers. So I'm dev married to ops. We were joking earlier, and that really is a true story. And one of the things I always argue with my husband about, years and years ago, we both worked with AccuWeather. And I was designing some stuff that was around satellite ingestion. He was operations, and I wanted to see. I wanted to see the logs. I wanted to see queues. I wanted to see this. And so it became a dinner time argument. But through the years, I've seen that manifested with clients. And as I go forward and try and help my developers to get access so that they can see it, so how do you, especially in the federal setting, with the types of data that you're dealing with, especially when you're dealing with multiple different vendors, federal employees, et cetera, how do you provide the right type of access to allow development some sort of visibility into what's going on? What are those dashboards? What is it that you allow them to do so that they have a sense of responsibility against it as well? Doesn't mean that they're taking the place of operations folks, but it means that they're looking at it and they're seeing, well, I'm seeing memory go up there. I thought that I released those threads, right? Or they're starting to think about that, and they actually will be more energized to bring higher quality to the table.
So one of the questions I often get, and I'm sure one that's on the mind of some of the folks in this room, is where do you start? And Ray, let's take your organization, for example. Obviously a very large distributed organization. You're in charge of the Center of Excellence that is driving best practice across those organizations. Where do you start?
That's a hard one, right? I think you have to take sort of a multi-prong approach, right? And part of it is pick a greenfield project or two, right? So that you can show people how to do it from the start, right? Then also you've got to have those, picking a project that's a long-term, ongoing project. Then you can find the ones that are at the right point in their life cycle where you can say, between releases, right? And show how they transition, right, from the traditional way to doing Agile and DevOps, and then making sure that you do. First time, a couple times I saw that happen, we didn't do the measurements, right? What you really got to do is do the measurements. To say, give me the data before, give me the data afterwards, right? I want to see that, tenfold dropped in delivered defects. I want to see that, 20 times increase in rate of delivery. right? So you got to measure that. So then you can go and have those good stories to tell people why they should do it, and then establish some places for people to, give their best practices back to the organization, right? So that they can go, so someone else is saying, hey, I'm using tool X, or this process. How is someone else making it work for them?
So I've seen it done both ways. And what I mean is, I've been with organizations who've made the decision that they are going to have a DevOps strategy, and they're going to have a DevOps roadmap. Oftentimes that will die under its own weight because it is so big, and you're trying to do something nimble with a very great, big, heavy strategy. Now, that having been said, it doesn't mean that you can't have or shouldn't have an enterprise set of goals and enterprise imperatives that drive people towards that. Now, I've also seen it gone where they have done something that is almost pilot-like, very, very small. And to your point, if it's too small, it becomes nothing more than an experiment in the corner. So it's finding the right mix. It's also making sure that you have the funding that's going to go with it. One of the clients that I'm working for on the civilian side right now, they're looking at tying it to a major program that has a whole lot of funding that's going to be behind it. So how do you use something that has momentum to drive that forward? So it's like everything else that we do in managing the portfolio. It's making a bunch of different decisions against it, but having the champions, understanding the why that you're doing it and setting out the measurements against it.
How important is communication, and specifically communicating success, communicating areas of opportunity for improvement? So how important is communication to the DevOps adoption?
I would say it's very important, right? Because the biggest thing is, like you heard from all three of us, one of the biggest obstacles with respect to DevOps is the cultural transformation. And the most important ingredient to make that cultural transformation is communication. Being able to communicate success, being able to celebrate risk-taking from the team, because it's all about fail fast. It's all about being able to try something, fail fast, and operate with a lot of nimbleness. And so that's the cornerstone to that is going to be around the communication.
Like what you said, celebrating the risks that people took, as opposed to celebrating only successes, because you want to celebrate their failures, which sounds crazy, but you want to celebrate the fact that they tried this. And you need to give latitude for people to fail. And that's a hard mentality, especially given waterfall. I need to drive to 0 defects before I get to here. I need to drive to this number. Instead, if I allow people to do small batch, right, we're making the smallest change possible. We're addressing the defects as quickly as possible, and we're allowing people to fail, and we're celebrating the fact that they're failing. The communication, at the end of the day, regardless as to whether you're doing a huge or a pilot, I actually put that as probably the center part of all of this, is the communication, and I'll tag on the word transparency. I want my executives to see the defects. Yeah, I actually don't, but I do. I want people to see those defects. I want the developers to know that the defects are being seen, not as a way to intimidate them, not as a way to make them feel bad, but it becomes something, it becomes a natural part. Love me, love my warts. Here's how we're doing. We're moving towards getting fewer defects. I want to see that the first round defects was higher, and that as they go across environments, that's getting lower, 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 lower. Not that it's high in one environment, gets low because maybe some group is not doing the kind of testing that I want, and then jumping again. So that transparency, what are the throughput numbers? Taking it up from a single project, then start to bring that up to the program level, and then up to the portfolio level. How are my different programs doing against one another? All of those act as motivators. You can then see where other problems and challenges are. So dashboarding is the, I guess you could say, the technology underneath it, or the enabling tool for it, but I'm a firm believer in getting rid of status reports and moving towards dashboards that are at the right level of granularity for the different audiences.
Yeah, no, the transparency, I think, is a big part of communication. But I also know, is coming from a large organization, right, the actual just communicating to, the engineering staff, right, is difficult, right? I mean, they don't read the weekly emails that come out from engineering, right? They don't, so, that's especially when you're spread across, and in our case, we're spread across probably a couple hundred locations, right? That has become that's we're seeing is one of our big challenges, is how do we actually communicate those successes? How do we communicate the failures in a way that people are getting it and hearing it?
Are you doing anything, or is your organization doing anything with like the roadshow concept?
Yeah.
I've seen that recently with the IRS in particular, where they are doing roadshows. So they're taking the success and they're taking it across all of their different locations, and they have an internal, like a TV station. I forget what it's called offhand, but they're broadcasting the successes and sharing those out in public forums.
Right, and that's what we're starting to do to address that exact problem about communicating across the large organization.
So let's open it up and give the audience an opportunity to ask questions. We can take questions via mic. You also can submit questions online at pigeonhole.at, and the password is CAGovSummit17. So let's start with Joe.
Challenges. You might have mentioned it, but I didn't hear it. The regulatory portion of it, is that a challenge when it comes to the agile or DevSecOps or DevOps, DevOpsSec, whatever you want to call it? Because to us, from our perspective in our corporation, it's a big challenge, not only on the government side, but also on the commercial side. The minute they hear, in some cases on the government side, they hear the word agile, you're not even allowed to bring it up in a meeting. And a lot of it has to do with the regulatory aspect of it. There's certain policies, procedures, things like that in place. Things that are already in place that they don't want to change or they can't change. Do you see that as one of the hurdles?
Absolutely, right. And I also see it as an issue is that a lot of times what happens is you might on a particular program or in a particular organization get some of that culture and hurdle changed, and then what happens is, that champion leaves, and the next person comes in and says, where's my control gates that I'm used to, right? So yes, it is a big challenge, and it's one that we're constantly fighting. It seems like we fight it over and over again.
Listening to the whole thing, taking a lot of notes, and agree that much of the issue centers around change, but we all work in an environment, whether we're on the private sector side or the government sector side, where those that have the executive level leadership, for the most part, change every 4 years, every 2 years, and the policy that governs us is more antiquated than our oldest technology and our facilities that we're dealing with. As those that, we all know the answers to provide the customer, or in government's case, constituencies, better services, but getting that ear, is there any thought that you all have on how we better position to get that executive leadership in the appointed or the elected areas so that the policy can change to allow those that we're working with to do the job better?
I have a couple thoughts. Go ahead.
No, go ahead.
Gosh, it's very complex, right? Very convoluted. There are a number of different things. At the end of the day, education is going to be a core part of this, and being able to track it back to business value or the risk that you are averting. If you come in and say, we're going to be able to do things a lot faster, people are going to say, so what?
Exactly.
If you are able to say that we are likely to statistically bring our defects, our production security infractions from X to A, right? From this, that gets their eyes. And so if you have to go into this with your team educated, having a very simple, clear, repeatable taxonomy that you're using across your organization, so that taxonomy, as you're talking to your leaders, and that you're using the same words. Right? When you talk about DevOps, it means a lot of different things to a lot of different people. I focus on a couple of very specific vertical principles that we make sure that everybody agrees on what those principles are, right? Continuous integration, automated testing, software-defined infrastructure, for example, continuous monitoring. You have to be able to talk about those things continually. But tying it back to how are you addressing what the risk is, right? The regulation is there to address a risk. So what is that risk, and how are you addressing that? How are you mitigating that with this altered approach?
No,
Silence.
Exactly. No,
Silence. Oh, no.
I think you hit it right on, yeah.
So,
Any other questions in the room in the back?
In the industry, general perception is that if agency is trying to go to cloud and also wants to do DevOps, which one should be done first? Now, I would imagine that going to cloud should be done first, but maybe they're different opinion. And we were in touch with the agency not too long ago, maybe 3 months ago, and they were very adamant to go to DevOps first before going to cloud. And the reason was they felt that if they did the DevOps first, they will lose their jobs. I wonder if you have any comments.
well, I have a lot of strong opinions on this one. So when we say we're going to the cloud, gosh, that's a great big thing. So are we talking about shifting workloads so we're leveraging infrastructure? Well, that's a little bit different than using platform as a service, which might be completely different than using some software as a service. So first of all, you need to define where on the continuum. What is it that you're doing on that continuum? Second, we all have to realize that unless we're doing something that is absolutely siloed and net new, there are integrations. So on-premise is still going to be a part of the equation. So the move to cloud and the move to DevOps, they can be wildly tied together, but it's not necessarily a chicken or an egg. So if I want to shift some workloads right now, I can probably take those workloads as they are, take the VM, just move the images, right? I'm oversimplifying that, obviously, but that doesn't require me to change my deployment methodologies per se. So I don't have to change to DevOps yet. However, if I'm building net new cloud native, I'm going to start from ground zero, and I'm going to leverage as many of the DevOps pieces and parts that I can.
So adding on to that, with respect to the cloud, one of the key things is when you think about moving into the cloud, the tools at this particular point are important, right? So it depends upon whether you are building your own private cloud or you're talking about moving into a public cloud strategy. And if you're going into a public cloud strategy, there are 3 big vendors across the board, Azure, AWS, and Google Cloud, and they have their own set of tools. But if you actually want to implement DevOps, depending upon how you actually want to do it, whether it's around improving the quality, improving the speed, there are going to be a set of tool sets which you actually need to adopt. And being able to make sure that those tools can work in a hybrid environment becomes very important, because AWS has their own tools which will only work in the public cloud. But having tools which will go bridge from public to the on-premise environments into a private cloud becomes a big critical part of your discussion when you think about the tools.
And the diversity in these enterprises, whether it's federal or commercial, that's a major part of it.
Right. And in some respects, though, I think sometimes you might actually, I mean, you've got to do the study, right? But a lot of times, right, you might want to do the DevOps part first, just because if you move it to the cloud and then you can't update it quickly, you might be in lots of trouble, right?
If I were doing SaaS, I were doing SaaS in the cloud, it would be a no-brainer there.
Right,
Absolutely.
right. But in a lot of my cases, right, we're, like you said, we have to worry about not just going to the cloud, but I mean, we have to do DevOps for, things that are going to go in aircraft and, all sorts of things, right? So,
I think we just all said it depends.
It depends, right? Right.
Looks like we have time for 1 or 2 more questions. Check the online queue. All right. Well, any closing thoughts before we wrap up this session?
Start. Make a decision and start. Leverage Agile principles, and I use lowercase a. I'm not preaching any methodology. In your day-to-day work, if you start to embrace Agile techniques about transparency, about communication, some of the other pieces as you're rolling forward will become a natural stepping stone, but start.
I would say think about what's your primary goal and driver, and then walk your way down in terms of if you want to go down. You asked a question on how do you basically get people come and go, the leadership changes happen. But if you are focusing on a particular goal, whether your business driver is speed, it's quality, customer experience, and then you tie it to the underlying metrics, and you start implementing the changes small, start somewhere, start small, and constantly show success. It doesn't matter who comes and goes, right? So you'll be able to go at it with, like she said, like a business dashboard with data points in terms of the changes you have actually accomplished within the organization.
Yeah, start, measure, and adapt.
Yep.
Right?
I like it.
That's what you've got to do.
Okay.
Great. Well, I want to thank you all, Ray, Aruna, Tracy, for joining us today on the panel. And thank you all for joining us and the questions you asked as well. So enjoy the rest of your afternoon. Thank you.